Great. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Brandon Kyle. I am the Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at Pitzer College. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special presentation and discussion during our first ever virtual family weekend. We are so pleased to have you with us today as we explore the work of filmmaker Paul Espinosa on the music and activism within Espinosa's feature-length documentary, Singing Our Way to Freedom. This presentation is brought to you through a collaboration between the Racial Justice Initiative, the Pitzer College Art Galleries, and the Office of Advancement. Today, to lead us in discussion, I am pleased to introduce to you Pitzer's very own Professor Pantoja. Adrian Pantoja is a professor of political studies and Chicano studies, and one of our associate deans of faculty. He is also chairing President Oliver's Racial Justice Initiative, and most importantly, he is a proud Pitzer parent of a current student and an alumnus. Professor Pantoja's teaching and research revolves around the Latino population with a focus on their voting behavior and political attitudes. He has published nearly 4 dozen academic articles in professional journals and edited volumes. For the past 8 years, he has worked as a political consultant for a political polling firm. He is the author of over 50 political blogs and has given countless interviews to national and international media about the Latino population. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Adrian Pantoja. Thank you, Adrian.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank the Office of Advancement for working with me to host this event during Family Weekend. It's unfortunate that we can't be live, but this works out as well. Today's event, as Brandon pointed out, is in collaboration with the Pitzer Art Galleries. This semester, as part of the ongoing manifesto project, we're asking students, staff, and faculty, but this also includes alumni and families, to submit protest songs. I can't think of a better way to promote protest music than by having a discussion on the life of Ramon Sanchez, the Chicano songwriter, activist. And again, none of this would have been possible without the support of President Oliver's Racial Justice Initiative. This semester alone, we have thus far about over 2 dozen speakers coming to classrooms and open forums at Pitzer College, all on the theme of racial justice. This is one of those lectures that is being sponsored by the Racial Justice Initiative. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Paul Espinosa. Paul Espinosa, an award-winning filmmaker and producer, is the president and CEO of Espinosa Productions, a film and video company specializing in documentary and dramatic films focused on the US-Mexico border region. He has been involved with producing films for over 35 years and is professor emeritus in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. We met when I was a professor at ASU many years ago. Espinosa received his PhD from Stanford in anthropology, where he specialized in cultural analysis of television communication, and a BA degree from Brown University, also in anthropology. He has worked with the public television stations in San Diego and Dallas as a senior producer and executive producer, specializing in Latino and US-Mexico border topics. Espinosa produced, directed, written, hosted numerous programs for PBS. Paul has numerous awards and achievements, too many to list. You can go to his website, espinosaproductions.com, and you can see his impressive list of films and impressive awards. The film we'll be discussing today is also the recipient of numerous awards. His company, Espinosa Productions, uses the power of media to tell stories about unsung heroes whose lives inspire us. The films capture the transformative energy of the men and women of the US-Mexico borderlands, both past and present, and reflect a deep commitment to the community's culture, history, identity, and struggle. In the telling of these meaningful stories, we seek to expand understanding, provoke dialogue, and honor emotions that link the experiences of these individuals to the larger human tapestry of our times. So we're going to be discussing one of those films today, Singing Our Way to Freedom, which explores the life of the Chicano musician, Ramon Sanchez. The film is described as follows. This feature-length documentary film is a multi-layered portrait of Ramon Sanchez, musician, composer, and community activist from San Diego. From the early days of the Chicano civil rights movement alongside Cesar Chavez through today's immigrant rights protests, Chunky used music to energize our political imagination in the struggle for social justice. Our film examines how Chunky's inspiring career as a musician is interwoven with the broader history of the Chicano movement, a cultural movement nearly forgotten today. A portrait of one charismatic musician and activist allows us to revisit this pivotal era in American history and to provoke dialogue about the many hurdles that have had to overcome to gain equal rights for Mexican Americans. Welcome, Paul, and I'd encourage the audience to please see the film if you have not done so. We have it on Sakai. If you're a parent or an alumni, well, if you're a parent, you can log in through your son or daughter's Sakai account to watch the film. And of course, it's available for free for everyone. Before we get into your latest documentary, I want to learn more about you, Paul, as a filmmaker. You're an anthropologist by training. So my question when I read your bio is, how does an anthropologist become a filmmaker? What drew you to films?
Well, thank you, Adrian, for inviting me to participate today. I really am honored to be with you and thrilled to be with participating in this weekend event that you're having, and this racial justice initiative, which is really a wonderful thing and a very needed thing for all colleges and universities these days. Basically, I was always interested in finding a bridge between anthropology and media. All of my training is in anthropology. I still am really sort of a practicing anthropologist, although I've never really, done that per se. But I think if you see my work, you see the anthropology sort of interwoven in it. But essentially, well, anthropologists typically, when I ask people, well, what do you think what does an anthropologist do? And they usually say, oh, well, anthropologists go someplace far away and study what the natives do, South Africa or, someplace Australia. Well, I decided to go to Hollywood and study what the natives do. And I did an ethnographic study of a television studio in Hollywood to sort of look at how they go about creating television, not from a technical point of view, but more from a cultural point of view. And I guess that although I wasn't really planning to go on to do any kind of filmmaking, I learned so much in that process and kind of got the bug, I guess, to start working in particularly in documentaries. And I felt I sort of was able to kind of be in the right place at the right time and started producing films for public television, which really I knew nothing about public television, frankly, when I began. This is back in the mid to late 70s. But anyway, I was able to find a niche for myself and start producing films I was based in San Diego, as I have been for most of my career, although I did spend some time in Arizona where we met a number of years ago. But I've really been in the San Diego-Tijuana border region for many years, and my films have been sort of located either in San Diego or along the border region. I've done several films in Arizona. I did a series called The Border, which was looking at different parts of the U.S.-Mexico border and trying to present some alternative perspectives about the region that I thought were not being well presented. So anyway, I kind of made this transition. But like I say, I really feel like my work has been kind of a bridge between media and anthropology. Certainly part of the impetus for my work was an interest in trying to reach a larger audience. I think that I felt that a lot of the insights that get developed in the academy sometimes don't get too much further than the academy. And I felt that it was important to try to reach larger audiences with some of these ideas and some of these stories.
So you focus on the borderlands, the U.S.-Mexico border, and you kind of answer this question coming from San Diego. I was born in El Paso, Texas. The border has a special meaning for me. I have family all along the U.S.-Mexico border, so it's a special place. It's also a painful place too. It's full of contradictions. What's your relationship to the border?
Well, good question. Actually, I was born and raised in New Mexico. I grew up in Albuquerque, which isn't right on the border, but certainly New Mexico is a border community. I know El Paso well. We would go to El Paso and to Juarez often. In fact, I actually professionally, for a number of years, I was trying to do a documentary about El Paso del Norte, which has been just the gateway, the southern gateway to the United States. I think the El Paso story is just a tremendously important story. Again, another unsung story, frankly, but maybe that'll have to wait for a later time. Yeah. But I don't know. I basically came to California to do graduate work, and and ended up at a certain point, I was in Los Angeles doing my field work, but got connected to a public television station in San Diego, and then started producing films, and being here, I guess being having an anthropological perspective, the whole idea of being in this very binational, bicultural region, it was just a tremendous place to produce work about what was happening here in the region. I mean, obviously I have a lot of films dealing specifically with the Latino experience, but really the Latino experience is partly a trans-border experience, essentially. And so I guess, I don't know, I just feel, my family, I grew up in New Mexico. Actually, my parents are from Southern Colorado, and that Southern Colorado, Northern New Mexico region that some people may know is a region where people have lived for, centuries, basically. I can actually trace my family back, 4 centuries, essentially. So it's a special place, obviously infused with, these certainly Latino, Hispanic, Spanish, culture over generations. And I guess I feel like I've just been very privileged to be able to tell some of the stories, some of the many stories that are happening in this region, many more that still need to be told. But anyway, that's for some of the students that you have there at Pitzer College.
That's right. That's right. Well, we'll get into the subject of what stories have yet to be told, but let's talk about storytelling. How do you pick your unsung heroes? Do you find them? Do they find you? What's the process? We're going to get into this film, but some of your other films, how did that come about?
Well, I guess obviously every film has its own genesis. One of my this film, one of the titles that I considered for this film was Ballad of an Unsung Hero, and but I have another film that's called Ballad of an Unsung Hero, which was a film about Pedro J. Gonzalez, who was basically a musician and singer back in the 1920s. He was a very, obviously somewhat unknown today, but a very important composer and singer in his own right. He was born in Mexico. He was a telegraph operator with Pancho Villa. Came to Los Angeles and became one of the biggest recording stars of his generation. Was extremely well known. Not just in Southern California, but all over the Southwest. Just a small anecdote, that was a documentary film that I did in 1984, a half-hour film that did get onto the national PBS schedule. And we must have gotten hundreds of letters from people who saw the film and could not believe that he was still alive. He was already 85 when we did this film. And lots and lots of people who remembered their parents listening to him on the radio early in the morning before they went off to work, because he had been able to get buy airtime on KMEX, no, not KMEX, basically one of the really large Los Angeles stations that basically broadcast all over the country. Anyway, he was just a fantastic character. But anyway, that was a character that I learned about when I was here in San Diego through other people. I mean, each film has its own genesis. I think there's just, like I say, there's so much that could be done. I mean, I don't know, we can transition to Chunky, but Chunky I've known for years. I've known him really almost since I first came to San Diego, and he's somebody whose music actually he did music for several of my earlier films, the Lemon Grove Incident that some people know, early film about one of the earliest school desegregation cases in the United States. So anyway, each film has its own genesis in terms of people. Obviously each time you have to think about like what are the elements that you could make work in a film, which is a separate challenge, I guess, altogether.
Yeah, and my next question was about Chunky. So how did you guys meet? I've heard his music. I just didn't know the man behind the music. It wasn't until this documentary that I'm like, oh, now I can put a face to these songs that I've heard for many years. How did you guys meet?
I'm not even sure when I first met Chunky, but it was not too long after I came to San Diego in the late 70s and started producing films. And I think that, and I was basically really focused specifically on, Chicano Latino stories. And our paths just crossed repeatedly. Chunky he had his own band at that point, and really almost any, political demonstration that you went to, as well as many cultural events, Chunky and his group at that time was Los Alacranes Mojados, and he would play at many events. And so I met him very early on, and like I say, our paths just crossed repeatedly like in San Diego as somebody doing sort of cultural work. I just knew of him. And like I say, he did music for two of my films that I did scored music for two of my films in the 80s. And I actually, well, if you, in the film, we also have like a performance. We have several performances, but one of the performances is like in front of a live studio audience, and where we have several of his songs, what he's playing, that we sort of interweave into the film. That was a part of a film. That was part of a show that I did, just a performance show with his group back in the early 90s. And of course, I used some of that in this film. But I don't know, Chunky was always somebody that I just felt was very, just a very dedicated person to his community. I think somebody who really, loved his community, did everything he could to sort of improve the lives of people around him. Obviously used music as his vehicle, a very, very charismatic, very, very funny guy, a humorous guy on stage. Was very good at keeping an audience engaged, Anyway, I just felt that his work was important, and kind of the typical sort of unsung hero who's not really acknowledged. I mean, people knew him, certainly people knew him in the Chicano community, and some people knew him in the larger community. And sort of over time, I think his band became relatively well known, at least in Southern California. He did perform all over. I mean, we're gonna do a big screening in Kansas City. Kansas City had a huge following in Kansas City, and he used to go out to Kansas City, very, very often. But anyway, I just felt like, obviously, because his story was all not just connected as a musician who was an activist, but he was really connected to Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. He was really, as we say in the film, Cesar Chavez's favorite musician. He was somebody who basically not only was just involved, back in the late 60s, 70s, but really continued to be involved and can continue to be involved as somebody dedicated to what I would call, community building, basically using art and music for community building, both in his specific community, San Diego, but also the larger, binational community. So I felt that he was somebody that I felt I really would like to, do something about.
And the story looks at Chunky's life from his birth, 1950s, into the 2000s. I mean, so this is a film that spans 6 decades. It's a film it's about Chunky, but it's about the broader Mexican American. I can't help but see myself in the film and the experiences and relive some of these decades. But there's a moment in time that's pivotal to Chunky's life, and that's the late 60s, the Chicano Movement. For those in the audience, what was the Chicano Movement, and what was Chunky's role in that movement? You alluded to Cesar Chavez, but how else was he involved in this thing we call the Chicano Movement?
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, part of the reason that I wanted to, doing a man's entire life is a challenge in any film. So but I felt that there was a lot of key moments about his life that certainly I identified with, and I felt other people would identify with as well. I mean, I think the Chicano Movement comes out of the experiences of young Chicanos, primarily in the 1960s and 1970s, who basically were coming of age and were feeling the sense of great amounts of discrimination, certainly on the part of their parents, who they saw, working very hard, whether they were in the fields or in the cities. And they're already, by that point, I would say the majority of Mexican Americans were in the cities, but certainly there were still a lot in the rural areas as well. But anyway, just a growing sense of being outside of the outside of power. And certainly this was also part of the larger civil rights movement that was generated by African Americans, and the women's movement, and the anti-war movement as well. There was a great deal of things going on in the 1960s that young Mexican Americans really identified with. And so it was sort of a coming of age. And Chunky was right there, right? Certain Chunky comes out of a very rural, basically his family were farm workers. His father, both of his parents were immigrants from Mexico. They came like in the 1920s, basically. They lived in the Central Valley near Blythe, which is about 80 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border, right on the border between Arizona and California. But anyway, he essentially again, through kind of a typical story, somebody takes him under his wing and brings him and about a half dozen other young Chicanos to San Diego from Blythe. He literally puts them in a car and takes them to San Diego to apply to San Diego State, because he knows this guy who's kind of a community activist in Blythe, that essentially this is the time of the beginnings of affirmative action, and that, you know, there's a possibility that these young guys, not just guys, but young Chicanos might be able to go to college, which was completely not part of their game plan. I mean, they didn't know what the opportunities were for them. And essentially, you know, he literally takes them there, has them fill out the paperwork. He comes home, and then, you know, a little bit later, Chunky gets word that he's been accepted, which he's actually shocked by, I think. But so he goes to San Diego. Basically, he starts actually January of 1970 at San Diego State. And of course, the whole Chicano movement is, again, driven a lot by young Mexican-American students, primarily in colleges and also in high schools, and becomes very involved with Mecha, well, one of the things that was going on in San Diego State, which was really unique, was there was a young professor, a Mexican-American professor, Jose Pepe Villarino, who basically got the students together to play music, and they got involved very quickly in what we would call protest music. And essentially, you know, again, these were young men and women. Chunky came to that with a lot of musical experience, as we hear in the film. You know, he was already very talented as a musician. But anyway, this young group would go out and play, and essentially they very quickly got connected to the farm workers and to Cesar Chavez, and they began to go to Chavez, to where Chavez was, and play at many demonstrations between 1970 and 1974. And you know, obviously this was all part of his becoming, you know, conscious, so to speak, not only being involved in this larger social justice movement, really, but also seeing what role he could play, and particularly what role music could play. You know, obviously there are many people involved in this, you know, fighting on various fronts in terms of labor organizing and education. But I think Chunky was able to find his own place in that, which was music and art, and, you know, really make a major contribution to that period. And then sort of, but also continue, because I think that this fight for social justice that was part of his, you know, very central to his experience at that point, was something that he carried with him into, you know, really for the rest of his life.
Let's talk about this consciousness, because there are pivotal moments in his life: San Diego State, meeting Chavez, getting involved in Chicano Park. But there was one moment that hit me like a lightning bolt, because I had experienced that. And I want to read you what he says. Yeah. Chunky goes to Mexico in the 70s. And he says, "I was flabbergasted by the pyramids, the mercados. Everything was Mexican. This is my roots. Where have you been all my life? You know what I mean? Climb the pyramid of the sun, and you stand up there and open your arms up to the gods, man. It was like a whole reincarnation of you as a person. This is what mom was talking about. This is where pops came from. I was like a little kid finding a new candy store that you didn't even know existed." Mentors are important. Events are important, but this is a place. This is maybe the homeland. In your characters, in Chunky's life, what, you know, and this hit me, you know, because I experienced it. You're not the same person when you go there and you come back.
Right.
What does the homeland mean in terms of the consciousness for your characters, for Chunky, for other people in your story? You know, Mexico's a stone throw away. You know, we're in the borderlands. It's just right there. You know?
Right. No, well, that's a wonderful story. I'm glad you, and as you say, a very pivotal moment in a way, because Chunky, actually, like a lot of Chicanos, even though he grew up in Blythe, and you know, which is not exactly right on the border, but is a broader, you know, border community. And obviously, once he came to San Diego, he certainly, you know, crossed the border many times. But like many Chicanos, really his experience of Mexico was very limited. You know, that was the first time he'd ever really been in Mexico, you know, central Mexico, like, shall we say. And a lot of Chicanos were exactly in the same position of really not really knowing Mexico, even though the larger society saw them as Mexicans. They were Mexican, and that was really, in a lot of cases, a put down. You know, we can have a larger discussion about even the term Mexican. But anyway, they were seen as Mexican, but in many ways they knew very little about Mexico. And certainly in their educational upbringing, their schools weren't teaching them very much about Mexico. Mexico was not something to be taught about or to be seen as something to be proud of, right? So essentially, it was like it was very limited. And of course, one of the things that happened during this time period, again in the 1970s, was not just Chunky, but many Chicanos went to Mexico City for the first time, and it was really like a pilgrimage, as we say in the film. It was like a pilgrimage to go to Mexico City and to all of a sudden see this this culture in this city, this community, this civilization, basically. That, you know, here in Mexico, you know, Mexico civilization is deeper than, you know, civilizations in almost any place in the, you know, 2 centuries, two millennia deep at least, right? If not more. And when we say civilization, we're talking about cities, right? I mean, you know, Tenochtitlan, what is now Mexico City, probably at the time it was in its heyday, it was probably one of the largest cities in the world, you know, on a par, larger probably than many European cities. Anyway, so he goes to Mexico, and then of course, as we say in the film, what happens when he goes to Mexico City? He happens to be there at a time of a major, you know, concert of protest music, and essentially he meets all of these very well-known protest singers, Mercedes Sosa, Gabino Palomares, other leaders in again, people that were using music in a way, in the same way that Chunky was learning how to use music for social activism and protesting the experiences of what was happening in their countries, and their, you know, Argentina, all these things that were happening in Latin America during this time period. And Chunky just really connected with that. And I think that also gave him more, you know, so really gave him sort of a global perspective, which I think is also something that I think was important about Chunky. I think he has a very kind of ecumenical attitude towards things, you know, and an ability also to kind of borrow from both sides of the border, as he says at different times, you know, essentially, hey, you know, I can take something from here, something from there. And that also is a very common transborder experience for Latinos, is basically being bicultural, being bilingual, being binational, and knowing that you can draw on different parts of your identity, even though in a lot of cases that identity is being sort of completely denigrated by the larger society. And I think that that's certainly one of the things that Chunky brought to the table, was getting people to feel pride in their background. I mean, he felt pride in his own background. And I think when people connected to his music, because music is a very powerful medium for speaking both to the mind and to the heart and to the soul. And I think he was just really able to do that. And you know, a lot of those songs that the music that he created was really a lot of times about identity issues and things that people really could feel in their bones, that, you know, he was speaking to them essentially.
Yeah. So I like that scene that you mentioned. So there's this incredible, you know, international energy, film festival music festival going on, folk music, you know, protest music going on. And for me, it seems like the 1960s, the activists of Chunky's generation, there was this transnational, international focus. There was this anti-imperialism, decolonization movement. But then it seems to me that dies out. I mean, is that an accurate representation that by the 80s and 90s, you know, these international connections die out? So I guess I have 2 questions. The first one is, did Chunky maintain those international connections? Was he able to perform in Latin America again later in life? And did those international, transnational connections remain, or did they fade over time?
Well, I think they remained somewhat. I would say certainly Chunky did go. I mean, he did establish really important relationships at that time with other young Mexican musicians and artists, really. And he was invited back to Mexico. I think he first goes in around 1973, and then I think in the mid 70s definitely returns on some extended tours. Actually, he and a number of other musicians that were part of the estudiantil that he was part of basically went back for like a month-long tour on more than one occasion to Mexico, and to play, you know, with groups, and to speak, and you know, they were definitely involved with hearing the same kinds of you know, kind of music about protest, music about the sort of the, the terrible agrarian conditions of campesinos in Mexico, and playing with them. Gabino Palomares, who is in the film, who actually I saw not too long ago, who's still alive. He remembers them coming, and other people that were part of that movement. I'd say, in all honesty, I don't think it continued at the same level. Although I guess we'd have to ask, what level did it occur on? I mean, there's been maybe there's been some interesting work done recently about the whole Chicano connection to Latin America starting in that time period, and I think a lot of again, stories that are not well known that I think we'll learn more about. That there's always been sort of this international dimension with particularly the Mexican American community and Mexico, in terms of activists, especially people that are sort of more on the progressive side. But no question, I think we need more of that. I mean, I think that's where borders do have an effect in terms of dividing us in ways that we really shouldn't be divided, and we need to find ways to transcend those borders. I mean, obviously, music and culture are really important elements in doing that. But we do have to fight, these larger, macroeconomic, macro-social, effects that are trying to cut us off from our connections. And then also, importantly, we don't learn that much. I mean, that's one of the things that also I think is really important, is that, I mean, certainly one of the things that I've realized in my career is that so many of the stories that I've told people, one of the first reactions people often say is, I never knew anything about this. And I'm talking, like, for instance, we in this film, we talk about Chicano Park, right? The whole creation of Chicano Park, which was a struggle to create this people's park in San Diego in 1970. Well, I've shown this film, a lot now, but I've shown this film, let's say, here in San Diego to young Latino audiences. And I've had experiences where people tell me that they live right by Chicano Park and they don't know anything about how Chicano Park came into being. And why is that? Well, the educational institutions it hasn't become part of the curricula, just like, so much of our larger history about the experience of Mexican Americans who are now, something like 40 million Mexican origin people are in the United States out of, 60 million Latinos. 40 million, that's more people than are in the whole country of Canada. And their experiences you're hard pressed to find their experiences in a social studies textbook at the high school level or the middle school level. So young people, they don't know anything about it. And this isn't just, obviously young Mexican Americans don't know anything about it, but young, Anglo-Americans don't know anything about it either. So I think certainly one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we really need to do a better job of educating our community and the larger world about our experiences. We need to find better ways of getting into the curriculum. I mean, certainly my work, my films have been about that, and I've tried to make my contribution, but it is a little frustrating sometimes, because now we're 50 years after the Chicano movement, and we're still trying to get into the history books.
No, that's true. That's and I want to come back to some of these questions, because I have a number of questions about, like, what's next and news stories and pop, the life of Chunky in the 60s and 50s. We're a very different place today, but what has changed, what has remained the same? But we'll get to some of those questions. Let me continue with the theme of identity, because there's one song, and again, there are these moments in the film where it's like a lightning bolt, like going up the pyramids, like, oh, I know what Chunky felt, and what you're describing in terms of the pride. I mean, there was a sense in me that it's like, I was lied to. People lied to me. We were engineers, we were architects, we were astronomers, we were mathematicians. You guys lied to us that we were just maids and these things, and nothing wrong with it. But we're everything.
Right.
We have these impressive civilizations. But there's one song of Chunky that it's hard. It's hard to hear. And I feel like it's the theme song of the film. Maybe not. I feel like it's a theme of the Chicano movement, of who we are as a people. But maybe you'll have a different thought on this. And the song I'm referring to is the song Pocho. And that's a song that has this, like, slow start, and then it just kind of ramps up and it's very powerful. But I want to read some of the lyrics, and I removed some of the lyrics for the sake of time. But throughout the song, he's using the word pocho. He says, pocho, a name I was called as a kid with the intention of humiliating and degrading me. Pocho, wasn't exactly sure what it meant at first. I felt emotional pain before I ever comprehended its verbal meaning. Pocho, it promoted self-hatred and confusion as to who I was and what I was doing here. Pocho, does the label really fit me? Maybe it does. And if it does, is it my fault? Pocho, I begin to realize that I had observed the strength of two cultures and lifestyles. Was that good or bad? Pocho, good que no? I have an innovative way of expressing myself that relates to both sides of the border. Pocho, and then it picks up. Pocho, what will it be today? Tacos or hamburgers? Pedro Infante or the Rolling Stones? Tequila or whiskey? A blonde or a morena? A Ford or a Chevy? Pocho, I'm beginning to think that there's pride in the word, a pride that was incarcerated by shame and stereotypes. Pocho, you know what? I am a pocho, a proud pocho. Proud because I have survived cultural denials and attacks on my soul. Pocho, Simón que yes, yo soy Ramon Sanchez, better known as Chunky. A little bit of that and a little bit of this. That's who I am, one badass pocho. And then the song continues. I mean, I felt that was the theme of the movie, and that's the national anthem of Chicanos. I mean, is that the case?
Well, yes. I mean, it's a very powerful song, and I think that, as you say, it's basically really again about identity and about this this feeling of being, so put down, and kind of like a coming to consciousness, basically, because he's kind of describing the experience of being put down and thought that you're nothing, and trying to believe that you have something to offer, and gradually coming around to it, and then saying, yes, sí, que soy I am a pocho, a proud pocho, I think that's a very important song, and of course, as you see, it's threaded in the film. It started. We have a little piece of it right near the very beginning when he tells the story about Facundo Gonzalez, his classmate in school, and then we come back to it later in the film. But and again, it gets pocho is kind of at least in my experience, pocho was a term that Mexicans used against Chicanos. Like you weren't Mexican.
How did you define that too for the audience? What's a pocho? What do you mean? What does he mean by pocho?
Right, like pocho was a term used by Mexicans in Mexico about Chicanos who weren't Mexican enough, who didn't speak Spanish well enough, who were had somehow lost their culture, right? And it was but on the other hand, the pochos, the Chicanos, were also kind of being, put upon by the Americans. Like, so it was kind of like you were caught in between. It was this betwixt and between experience of being sort of, put down and put out by two different cultures, and having to find your own identity, as people talk about it, this third space that Chicanos were sort of reclaiming what is theirs. Well, okay, I'm not from over there. I'm between here and there, kind of that experience. And I think a lot of people who are binational of whatever sort, have that experience of having been sort of people not knowing, who they are. Are you from over there? Are you from over here? And finding yourself, caught in the middle. But I think also what he's talking about is finding not only pride in that, but understanding that you have a power to be able to use two different cultures, two different languages, two different ways of seeing the world in a more powerful way. 1 + 1 = 3 kind of idea, basically. So I think, yeah, that's certainly, you're right. I mean, I guess that was one of the things that attracted me, or what I wanted to do with this film, was thread in a number of different themes that I felt that Chunky's life, represented. I mean, certainly, like what we've already talked about, this whole idea of experiencing Mexico. That was also experience that I had when I went to Latin America for the first time. I mean, I was just blown away, because I really didn't know. I mean, I had been to the border, but I had never been to Mexico, and to see these things was just, incredibly inspiring. And to know that, I don't know, that all this culture was going on there that you knew nothing about. So I think that, it was basically learning how to understand that you really do have a lot to contribute. And, hopefully that's something that's a little more relevant today, or people are more aware that, yes, if you're bilingual, you have certain assets, even though some people put that down, but there's certain things you can do. Even in terms of, giving you successfully avoiding dementia by being able to speak two languages, because your mind works in a different way. The neurons in your brain, communicate in a different way. So these are all things that are part of, this whole, bicultural experience.
And I can't help but feel when you look at the museums now, young Latinos, they might not even use the word Chicano, but they have, words, cultura, drink cultura, that the Pocho wins. So at the end, I can't help but feel like at the end, Chunky wins. We've embraced the Pocho. We're like, yeah, that's who we are. We're a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and all of those things. And there's pride in that. Before, you're right, there was a sense of shame, like not being Mexican enough, not being American enough. But I feel like there's folks have come to peace with that, or have embraced that. At least that's my sense.
No, I think that's definitely true. And I realize that we're also a much larger population today, and also, a better educated population in a formal sense, that there's more people that have had, college experience. And so, but yeah, no, definitely we're in a very different moment today. Certainly, I mean, when you consider Los Angeles and, what the history of Los Angeles, and it's taken this long for Mexicans to be properly, recognized, it's kind of amazing. But I think there is definitely we're in a different moment, and hopefully it's going to become even better.
Yeah. There's one moment again, there's so many moments in the film that I'm like, what am I going to pick here? I got an hour with you, and there's so many things I want to talk to you about. I'm skipping all kinds of questions, by the way. But there's one moment, it was a powerful scene, and it spoke to me, it intrigued me. And Chunky's reflecting on his life, and he says the following: sometimes I wonder, why I didn't do something else where I could be right now pretty well off, real rich, basking in the sun somewhere, I'm not dirt poor. I could be better off financially, but something just kept me going in the things that I was doing, in the cultural work that I was doing, that later on you realize, you know what? Because there were times where I doubted myself. What am I doing wrong? Am I doing the wrong thing? Why did you show that? Why was it important to put that in the film? Chunky having this sense of doubt that, did I do the wrong thing?
Yeah. Well, you're right. That's a very key moment in the film, and kind of a transition, because the first 2/3 of the film is sort of, kind of the heyday of the Chicano movement, the kind of the great success really of the musical group, and not so much in a financial point of view, but from just culturally being very successful. But I guess also I felt it was important to include, well, first off, I knew that, for being an artist, being, any kind of cultural worker is very difficult to survive, to make a living, to, provide for your family, to all of those things, which are kind of a cliche in our culture, but still basically true. And I just felt like, obviously, well, let me back up a little bit. One of the things that I did in making this film, I wasn't sure what I would do on Chunky, but one of the things that I did very early on, actually way before I was going to make a film, is I sat him down and did a really extended interview with him, because I was actually always concerned about his health. And so this is back in, I think, around 2004. I sat him down and did, like about a 3-hour interview, just his life story. And a lot of that is actually in the film. And I did do one subsequent interview with him, but a much shorter interview that we actually never see, but we hear his voice. But anyway, I felt like, there was just so much material there, basically. From first off, he was a very good storyteller. Obviously had lots of great stories, great humor, but also, Chunky was, I think it was kind of like, in a little way, like, well, he was unassuming, but I think a lot of times people didn't realize how clever he was with the words that he used, that he was very, very intentional about a lot of these things. And sometimes they might seem very sort of off the cuff, flippant, but of course he was somebody who had been working with this material, all his life. So his stories and his music are very accomplished, and in terms of the storytelling and kind of like what he's getting at, and his ability to tap into, like what you're talking about, these central issues of identity, of things that really mean something to people. So anyway, I just, it was a good place to sort of to try to make a turn into the present. Obviously we're getting back to the challenge of doing a man's life. How can you do justice to, 65 years of a man's life? Pretty difficult, but I knew that I wanted to have some stuff that was a little more contemporary, obviously getting into him at more now and, a much older musician, having struggles, but also continue to be dedicated to social justice, these being involved in this huge demonstration. You remember, because I was actually in Phoenix at the time, the demonstration in 2006, after the Sensenbrenner bill had been passed. But basically these, probably some of the largest demonstrations ever at that point in American history across the country. In Phoenix, the estimates were 200,000 people. In San Diego, it was the largest public demonstration in San Diego history. And Chunky was there, playing for the group. So anyway, I guess basically going back to that moment, it was a way to transition from this earlier period into a later period, but also to get people to reflect on the challenges of doing this kind of work, and that it's hard work. It's a very challenge, and we need to sort of acknowledge that, I guess, and appreciate that.
Yeah, and I was doing some research when I was thinking of this interview, this hero motif, and there's a moment where the hero, because your documentary is about these unsung heroes. So I put myself in the frame of the hero. There's these moments where the hero is vulnerable. He's got doubts. He's human. And that showed that that came out in that moment. And but you're right. There was one thing that struck me is that you think of the word the name Chunky. Well, can I take a guy seriously going around calling himself Chunky? And then when he speaks, it's deceptively simple. Like there's so much, the words you can tell that he's so careful in the words he chooses, and they seem so simple. But when I go back and reread some of these things that he said, I'm like, oh my God, this guy like knows how to pierce your heart. Just put the right words in the right order. And
right.
And again, that must be the musician in him, that he knows how to compose these lyrics and make them flow. I'm looking at the time, and there's so many questions here. So you're right. We're gonna have to have you back, hopefully in the fall when we're all in person, and we can do a live screening. I have one final question for you, and then I want to open it up to the audience. People can type in questions. It's a different time period. In the 1950s, when Chunky was born, there were 2.3 million persons of Spanish surname. 2.3 million. As you point out, today there's 40 million Mexicans, 60 million Latinos. I say, look, without African Americans and Latinos, there would be no Democratic Party. There would be no Biden victory. I mean, the numbers are there. We're kingmakers. But do we still need heroes? Are there still stories that need to be told? Are there still things that need to be addressed? We're powerful, we're growing. Is there still need? Is Chunky still relevant?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, certainly he's still relevant, but also, are there stories that need to be told? Absolutely. I mean, still, when you look at, I mean, I'm sure people see these statistics. I mean, in terms of mainstream media, we're still amazing. Latinos are still amazingly invisible. I mean, when you look at, let's say Hollywood films, television, I mean, of course, there's more and more stories being told, but in terms of the percentage, I mean, now you could say that about one in 6 Americans are Latino, and that number is going to grow to 1 in 3 in the next 40 years maybe. And we're nowhere near that in terms of the number of stories that you see on television, or the number of films that you see. Or for instance, if we take the news, if we look at like news, how, definitely there are stories being told by Latinos, but still in terms of, prorated, I mean, we're way below those numbers. So, and, significantly still, even after all this time period, the preponderance of those stories are still in a certain category of, workers, I mean, basically when I was coming up, 40 years ago, people were complaining about, well, we're just pictured as, as maids and gardeners and pimps and that kind of thing. Well, we're still being pictured that way, maybe not exclusively, but, still a lot more than other people. So I mean, there's still the mindset, the kind of the way in which this works on the imagination, particularly of young people, I think is very damaging, basically, for both young Latinos and young people of color and young white people, basically. That everybody needs to see more stories about other people that are not like them. And I mean, God, with there's so many stories that haven't been told. I mean, both of previous generations and current generations. We take pride in young athletes who do remarkably well, and there's just so much, and there's a need for that, because I think that speaks to our need to, it's not just heroes might be one way of putting it, but just to have representation alone. Representation matters so much, and to see something that is basically something like my story, that's important. That's important for people to feel that, to feel valorized, that their story matters, and I think we still have a long ways to go on that. We need way more people behind the camera, writing the stories, working on television shows, working on documentaries. I mean, we're moving in the right direction, but we're still way below parity. And we're trying to address that little by little, but it's definitely we're talking about a generation-long struggle, or a multi-generational struggle here.
Great, wonderful. So yeah, there's many stories that need to be told, and the work remains, and Chunky's as relevant today as ever. So let's get some questions from the audience. I see one from Maria Galvan, where this was based on an earlier discussion. I agree with Espinosa. More education on the Chicano movement and why it's taking more than 50 years. Why is it taking more than 50 years to educate our community? So this is a question about education. Why? Yes, the numbers are more, but we could be doing better. There's still these education gaps.
Well, I mean, one thing, like I say, or what I said earlier, let's take a look at textbooks. Actually, let's not just take a look at textbooks. Let's take a look at the process of how textbooks get created. Basically, textbooks, first off, the largest textbook markets in the country are Texas and California. And essentially, if you start learning about how textbooks get created, you learn that there's a huge battle over what gets into textbooks. And there's a great deal of reluctance on the part of, first off, there's very organized groups who fight very hard to get certain things in there and certain things out of there. And that includes some of the things that certain groups have fought very hard to keep out of the textbooks are, African-American and Latino stories. So yes, there's, maybe Cesar Chavez is mentioned, maybe the US-Mexican War is mentioned, but, in terms of the overall stories that people are learning about, or history that people are learning about, it's still, way, way below what they really should be learning. So, I mean, I think one thing is that we as a community should have a lot more, pay a lot more attention to advocacy around schooling, around textbooks, around curriculum. And those are challenges. Those are battles that take a lot of effort. You have to know what you're doing. We have to, like I say, I mean, there are organized groups in Texas in particular, and certainly here in California, who've been at this a long time to make sure that our stories are not part of the story, frankly. So, I mean, I think we need to do a lot more of that. Certainly what I just said about, obviously in terms of the entertainment media and the news and information culture, broadly speaking, we need to educate more people, or get more people in there. We also need advocacy. We need to be, these things are not going to happen without a certain amount of advocacy. And we have pushed to get more people involved, but it's a battle. It's definitely a battle that's ongoing.
No, absolutely. Again, I have lots of questions. I know the audience has lots of questions, but we've run out of time, which basically means we got to bring you back. We got to bring you back to continue this discussion and see some of your films. For the person that asked a question about education, you have a wonderful film on the Lemon Grove incident. Learn the history of segregation in San Diego and throughout the Southwest. The ongoing struggle for equal rights in the schooling. So there's lots of activism, lots of politics in your stories. Well, thank you, Paul, for joining us, for sharing with us this beautiful film. I encourage everyone to see it. It's a wonderful film, and all of your films are wonderful. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the future.
Yes, well, thank you, Adrian. It's been great to be with you, and I look forward to being with you in person, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.